Hello everyone, Dr. Webster here, and this is going to be the first video on one-way ANOVA. As I said in the announcement last week, I'm going to split up the video lectures into shorter, more digestible videos. So that you're not going to sit down and watch an hour and 15-minute video. You can take small breaks in between watching the videos as you watch and take notes. Hopefully you have watched the video about how to watch and learn from video lectures, and hopefully you will use those tips and guidelines that I went through in that video starting here. So this first video is going to be about discussing sort of how we are making the transition from t-test to one-way ANOVA. Right. So that's what we're going to primarily focus on here is talking about how t-tests are different from one-way ANOVA. Because conceptually, the leap from t-test to one-way ANOVA is actually not that big of a leap. I think it's pretty easy conceptually to think about how t-tests differ from one-way ANOVA. So let's begin. And no better way to start than to actually go back to start at talking about t-tests, right? So these research questions should look familiar here. So first we have a social psychologist wants to know whether people harbor more prejudice towards prostitutes versus feminists. And so what type of t-test did we conduct to answer this research question? That's right, paired sample t-test, right? And again, just as I talked about in the video on how to learn from video lectures, again, I'm going to be asking questions to you, right? And I'll give you a few seconds if you want to pause the video and think about the question and answer the question before I answer it. Right. But again, here we're going to conduct a paired sample t-test because we have one sample providing two different DVs, two different outcomes, right? But what if we added a third DV? What if we added a third outcome here, right? So what if we add prejudice towards lesbians as a third outcome here? We would no longer conduct a paired sample t-test. We'll actually conduct an ANOVA, a specific type of ANOVA that we'll talk about on the next page. So the second question here, a political scientist wants to know whether liberals or conservatives harbor more prejudice against feminists, right? So if you remember, what type of t-test did we conduct here? That's right, an independent sample t-test, because we have two separate groups, two independent groups. We have people who self-identified as liberal, people who self-identified as conservative. You're in one of those two groups. And we're comparing those two groups on this one outcome here, prejudice against feminists. But importantly, as I think we've talked about in class, right, we're missing a huge group here, right? We have liberals, we have conservatives, but we are missing the moderates, right? We're missing the people in the quote-unquote middle of the political spectrum, right? So what if we add one more independent group? What if we add moderates, right? We would no longer have two independent groups, but we would have three. And so we can no longer conduct an independent sample t-test. We'll have to conduct a specific type of ANOVA that we'll talk about on the next page, right? So conceptually, again, we're not making a very big leap here from the t-test to ANOVA, right? We're adding a third outcome, right? Prejudice towards lesbians, right? So we're comparing prejudice towards prostitutes, prejudice towards feminists, and prejudice towards lesbians all at the same time, right? But we can no longer conduct a paired sample t-test because now we have three different outcomes: prostitutes, feminists, lesbians, right? And it also makes sense, I should mention, right? Lesbians make sense here to compare to prostitutes and feminists because lesbians are predominantly like female group, right? And they are a socially derogated, socially maligned group. You know, people also probably harbor somewhat negative feelings toward lesbians. So it makes sense there, right? And then going from the independent sample t-test to ANOVA, right? For the independent sample t-test, we can only have two independent groups, right? But now we're adding a third group, moderates, to the mix. Right, so if we take a look at our first modified research question here. A social psychologist now wants to know whether people report differences in prejudice towards feminists, prostitutes, and lesbians, right? And so we can no longer use the paired sample t-test. We're going to have to use ANOVA, right? And ANOVA stands for analysis of variance. That's where the name comes from, but don't worry too much about remembering that this is analysis of variance. It's more important that everyone usually just says ANOVA. And the specific type of ANOVA that we'll need to conduct here is called a repeated measures ANOVA or a within subjects ANOVA. And so I generally refer to this type of ANOVA as within subjects because I think it makes the most sense to me. And I'll talk about why here in a second here. But just so you know that instead of typing out within subjects every time in the lecture, I will denote it as W/S, so within subjects ANOVA. So we're conducting a within subjects ANOVA because we have one sample providing more than 2 outcomes. Or another way to think about it is that we're comparing more than 2 outcomes within the same group of people. And so that's why it makes sense to me. That's why the within subjects part makes sense to me, because I can help keep that, I can help remember that that this is within subjects because we're comparing more than 2 outcomes within the same group of people. So we could add a 4th group here. We could have feminists, prostitutes, lesbians, and then I don't know. Oh my gosh, I am drawing a blank here. If we added, I don't know, female college students. I'm sort of blanking here, but we would use it within subjects ANOVA even if we added a 4th group, or a 4th outcome, 5th outcome. We would use within subjects ANOVA. Right. So graphically, right? If we do this graphically, we have here, right, the graph, the figure. For the paired sample t-test, where you had 1 sample and 2 different outcomes here, prejudice towards feminists and prejudice towards prostitutes, right? So we would conduct a paired sample t-test if the figure looked like this, right? But now, how are we going to modify this figure for the within subjects ANOVA? Right? How are we going to modify this figure to align with our new revised research question in which we are comparing prejudice towards feminists, prostitutes, and lesbians? And so here just add an arrow and add a box, right? And yes, it's really that simple, right? So, right, again, conceptually not that big of a leap here, right? From the paired sample t-test, 1 sample, 2 outcomes, right? To within subjects ANOVA, where we have 1 sample and 3 different outcomes. All right, so let's move on to the other revised research question, where a political scientist wants to know whether liberals, moderates, and conservatives differ in their levels of prejudice against feminists. Right. For this research question, now we are going to use a between subjects ANOVA. Right, so we have within subjects, and now we have between subjects ANOVA. And luckily there's only one term here, between subjects ANOVA. It's not called anything else. Because I just hate having more than 2 terms for the same damn thing. But luckily here we have between subject ANOVA, and I'll abbreviate that as B/S in the lecture from now on. Right. And so here we have a between subjects ANOVA where we have more than 2 independent groups and 1 outcome, 1 DV. Another way to say that is that we are comparing 1 outcome between more than 2 groups, right? So this distinction within subjects versus between subjects here, the between subjects makes sense here, right? We're comparing 1 DV between more than 2 independent groups. So if you do this graphically in a figure here, right? Here we would conduct an independent samples t-test because we have liberals and conservatives, right? And we're comparing liberals and conservatives on 1 outcome here, feminist prejudice, right? But now we've added a 3rd independent group, right? So how are we going to change this figure to align with our revised research question? How are we going to change it? And if you're like, Dr. Webster, we're just going to add an arrow and another circle, right? Yeah, right. We're just going to add another circle with an arrow here. So we have liberals, conservatives, and moderates, right? And we're comparing these three independent groups on the same outcome here, feminist prejudice. Right. So again, conceptually, the link from the independent sample t-test, right, where you have two groups, two independent groups, one outcome, right? Conceptually, it's not that big of a leap adding a third group here, right? Moderates, comparing moderates on their levels of, comparing liberals, conservatives, and moderates on their levels of feminist prejudice, right? So again, conceptually, not that big of a leap going from the paired sample t-test to the within subjects ANOVA, or the independent sample t-test to the between subjects ANOVA, right? We're just adding a box or adding a circle, right? Not that big of a difference, right? Not that big of a leap. Unfortunately, when we get to the SPSS output, things are going to feel a lot more complicated than they actually are, right? But if you can first master sort of conceptually the leap from the t-test to ANOVA here, you're in good shape. But just forewarning you, once we get into the SPS output, things are going to feel a lot more complex and complicated than they actually feel here. So I think I'm going to stop there for now before we move on to the next video lecture. And so with the next video lecture, we're going to start with a review slide where we briefly talk about what we talked about in this first video. But I'm going to try to keep these videos, you know, about 10 to 15 minutes long. So yeah, so I'll stop there for now and then move on to the next video.